Alessandro Moretti, the feared boss of the Moretti family in Chicago, only meant to indulge the housekeeper's 3-year-old daughter when he promised her 3 wishes. He expected Emma to ask for a doll, a pretty dress, or some expensive toy. But the moment the little girl spoke her first wish, the Mafia Boss stood frozen, and only seconds later, the man who terrified all of Chicago had to turn his face away to hide the tears he never thought he could still shed. Because Alessandro had no idea that this innocent wish was about to expose a shocking truth that had been silently buried for 10 years right inside his very own estate. Alessandro Moretti had built his empire on a single principle: trust nothing that could not be verified twice. At 39, he stood at the head of the Moretti family in Chicago, a name spoken with lowered voices in the darker corners of the city. His father had died before Alessandro turned 20, killed by a man who had shared his table only a week earlier. His older cousin, once his closest ally, had disappeared with $3 million and a list of names that took the family nearly 2 years to recover. In the 15 years since taking over the empire, Alessandro had buried more allies than most men attended weddings. Betrayal had stopped surprising him. It had simply become part of the arithmetic. His estate sat on the northern edge of the city, a stone fortress surrounded by iron gates, motion sensors, and men who never smiled. Cameras watched every corner of the property from angles the household staff had never mapped. 2 guards stood at the front gate at all hours. 2 more patrolled the gardens. A private security office ran 24 hours a day from a converted wing near the kitchen, though most employees believed it was simply an old records room. The mansion itself held 42 rooms, 4 fireplaces, an art collection worth more than most galleries owned, and a wine cellar that had been cataloged 3 times by different specialists. Yet visitors often described the house the same way: beautiful, but cold. The kind of cold that could not be corrected by turning up the heat. Alessandro had never married. He had never fathered children. Whatever softness he might once have carried had been folded away years ago, tucked into some private drawer along with the last photograph of his mother. He rarely dined with anyone. He rarely laughed. When he walked the long corridors of his own home, the household staff learned to step aside without looking up. He could not have named most of them if asked. Housekeepers, gardeners, cooks, and drivers moved through the estate like weather. They arrived, they worked, they left. That was the shape of it. Every practical matter of the household passed through one man: Marco Bellini, chief butler and administrator of the estate's finances and personnel. Marco had served the Moretti family for more than 10 years. He knew the wine order, the tax filings, the security roster, the maintenance contracts, the payroll ledger, and every quiet complaint the staff had ever whispered behind closed doors. He handled leave requests, disciplinary matters, and hiring. He signed for deliveries. He kept the books balanced to the penny. He answered his phone at any hour, and had never once raised his voice above a measured murmur. More than anyone else in Alessandro's life, Marco was trusted absolutely. Not because Alessandro loved him. Alessandro was not certain he loved anyone anymore, but because Marco had made himself indispensable through a decade of quiet competence, and in a world built on suspicion, quiet competence was the closest thing to loyalty a man could find. And so Alessandro Moretti slept behind fortified walls each night, surrounded by servants he could not name, protected by a man he had never truly seen. A house can hold everything a man owns, and still hold nothing that belongs to him. Among the many quiet lives inside the Moretti estate, 2 moved so softly that most guests would never have noticed them at all. Sophia Carter was 30 years old, and had worked at the estate for 3 years. She had come to the household with a single suitcase, a set of references from a hotel that had closed, and a face too tired for someone her age. Her husband had left before their daughter was born. Her parents had died within 11 months of each other during the same winter, and her only brother had drifted out of contact so long ago that she no longer knew what state he lived in. She had no one to call in an emergency. She had no one to leave her child with while she worked. When she interviewed for the position, she had almost not mentioned Emma. She had been afraid the child would cost her the job. But the woman who conducted the interview, a senior housekeeper named Margaret, had listened without interrupting, and then explained that the estate sometimes allowed live-in arrangements for reliable staff. Sophia had wept quietly on the bus ride home that afternoon, not from sadness, but from a kind of relief she had almost forgotten existed. The arrangement had one condition, stated clearly and repeated more than once. Emma could live in the rear staff quarters with her mother, but she was never to enter the main residence. The corridors, the library, the dining room, the study, the private wings, all of it was off limits. Emma had accepted this rule the way small children accept the shape of a room. She simply understood that some doors were not hers. Sophia was among the hardest workers on the household roster. She rose before the sun each morning and was already folding linens or scrubbing marble by the time most of the other staff arrived. She stayed late whenever she was asked, which was often. On many nights she returned to the small rear apartment only after Emma had fallen asleep, and she would sit for a moment on the edge of the narrow bed just to watch her daughter breathe before finally allowing herself to lie down. Emma had grown up in the shadow of a very grand house without ever truly living inside it. She knew the servants' corridor and the laundry room and the small courtyard where the gardeners took their lunch. She knew the kitchen door that opened onto the herb beds and the wooden bench where the older housekeepers rested their feet. She did not know the marble staircase or the library or the study, and she had never asked to see them. Her belongings could be counted on one hand: a few picture books, worn thin at the corners, a small tin of crayons, a cloth rabbit with mended ears, one of them stitched twice with different colored thread. Sophia had taught her that things could be loved for a long time without needing to be new. Emma was gentle, polite, and unusually devoted to her mother. She said please and thank you to everyone, even the delivery men. In those early years, Alessandro Moretti did not know either of them existed. Alessandro's first true glimpse of Emma came on an ordinary evening in early autumn, the kind of evening he would not have remembered under any other circumstance. He had taken the back stairs from his study to avoid a call he did not wish to receive. The service corridor was narrow and dim, lit only by the amber glow spilling from the kitchen doorway ahead. He stopped there, half hidden by the frame, because something in the small scene beyond had caught his attention without his permission. An elderly gardener named Thomas sat on the wooden bench near the herb door, his cap in his lap, his shoulders bowed with the particular weariness of a man who had worked outdoors his entire life. On the bench beside him sat a very small child with fair hair tied into an uneven ponytail. She held a single cookie in both hands as though it were something breakable. Alessandro watched her break it in two. She studied the pieces for a moment, then offered the larger half to the old gardener. Thomas began to shake his head, but the child pushed it toward him with such calm insistence that he finally accepted, murmuring something Alessandro could not hear. The little girl ate her smaller half slowly, one careful bite at a time, as though rushing would have been an insult to the sharing. Alessandro stood in the corridor longer than he meant to. A week later, in the same corridor at a different hour, he came upon the child again. This time she was kneeling on the floor in front of a housekeeper whose shoelace had come loose. The housekeeper, a heavy-set woman well into her 50s, was laughing softly and shaking her head. The child's fingers were far too small for the task, and the lace kept slipping through them. She tried 3 times, 4 times, her tiny brow furrowed with such seriousness that Alessandro almost smiled without knowing he had. The housekeeper finally reached down and tied it herself, thanking the child with a gentle pat on the head. The little girl accepted the thanks with a solemn nod, as though a great responsibility had been transferred to more capable hands. That night, alone in his study, Alessandro found himself staring at the fireplace without reading the papers on his desk. Some days later he saw her shoes. She was crossing the courtyard behind her mother, and the light caught her heels in such a way that he could see how thin the soles had become. One had worn nearly smooth, the other had begun to crack along the seam. He mentioned it, almost offhandedly, to Sophia. He said that one of the assistants could pick up a proper pair by the weekend. Sophia thanked him with careful politeness, then knelt beside her daughter and repeated the offer in words a child could understand. Emma listened, considered, and shook her head. "Mommy says we shouldn't take expensive things just because someone else is rich," she said. Her voice was quiet but perfectly clear. "The shoes still work." Sophia went crimson. She began to apologize, but Alessandro raised a hand to stop her. He looked down at the very small child in her very worn shoes and felt something unfamiliar tighten in his chest. He was surprised. He was, against his will, delighted. The evening that changed everything began like any other. Alessandro had worked late in his study, longer than he intended, and was making his way toward the kitchen for a glass of water when he took the service corridor again out of habit. He no longer avoided this hallway. Something about it had begun to draw him without his knowing why. The laundry room sat near the end of the corridor. Its heavy door was closed, but the small wooden bench outside it was occupied. Emma sat there alone. Her feet did not reach the floor. Her cloth rabbit lay across her lap, with its mended ears crooked from being held too long. She had one small hand curled around the rabbit's paw and the other tucked under her chin, and she was blinking very slowly, the way children do when they are trying very hard not to fall asleep. Alessandro slowed his step. He did not want to startle her. "You are up rather late," he said, softly. Emma lifted her head and looked at him without alarm. "Mommy isn't finished yet," she answered. "I want to walk back with her when she's done." "Does she know you are out here?" "She knows," she said just a little longer. Alessandro glanced past her, toward the far end of the corridor. Through the half-open doorway of the linen room, he could see Sophia. She was folding sheets from a tall wheeled cart, and she was doing it slowly. One arm braced against the edge of the shelving as though the shelf were the only thing keeping her upright. Her shoulders were drawn tight against her back. Her head hung a fraction lower than her body ought to have allowed. Even from this distance, he could see that she was working past the point where most people would have sat down. Something moved inside him that he had kept still for a very long time. He remembered a room from another life, and another woman folding another kind of laundry in the small hours of the morning. He remembered the shape of his mother's back at the ironing board when he was a boy, her wrists swollen, her breath thin. She had died before he had earned enough to make her stop. He had spent 30 years telling himself that everything he built was for her, and yet somewhere along the way he had built a house where another mother now folded sheets long after her child should have been asleep. He looked down at Emma. "Come with me a moment," he said. His voice was gentler than he remembered it being. He led her to a small sitting room off the corridor, one of the rarely used spaces the staff kept dusted out of habit. He motioned her toward a chair, and she climbed into it carefully, still holding her rabbit. Alessandro drew 3 blank cards from an inner drawer of the writing desk, cream-colored, edged in a thin gold line, the kind he used for personal correspondence. He placed them side by side on the polished wood in front of her. "Emma," he said, "I would like to make you a promise. You may ask me for 3 wishes, any 3, and I will do my best to grant them." Emma looked at the cards. She looked at him. She did not touch the cards. "Can the wishes be for somebody else?" she asked. A question can weigh more than a lifetime of answers when it comes from someone small enough to sit on your palm. Alessandro did not answer Emma's question at once. He asked her to wait, and then he sent one of the passing housekeepers to bring Sophia to the sitting room. Sophia arrived a few minutes later. She was still wiping her hands on the front of her apron when she stopped in the doorway and saw the 3 cream-colored cards on the desk. Her eyes moved from the cards to her daughter, then to Alessandro, and something in her face went pale. "Sir," she began, "whatever Emma has said, I am so sorry. She has said nothing wrong," Alessandro told her. "Please, sit down." Sophia did not sit. She glanced at Emma, and Emma smiled up at her with the calm certainty of a child who does not yet understand embarrassment. "I promised her 3 wishes," Alessandro said, "reasonable ones. I would like her to think about them properly, and I would prefer that you were here while she does." "Sir, this is far too much. Please, she is only 3. She doesn't. She refused a new pair of shoes last week because she said we should not take expensive things from wealthy people," Alessandro said quietly. "I do not think we need to worry that she will ask for too much." Sophia lowered her eyes. She still did not sit. Alessandro turned back to the child. "Emma," he said, "have you thought about what you might like?" Emma studied the cards for a long moment. "Maybe a doll?" he offered gently. "A pretty new dress? A room full of toys? A trip somewhere warm?" She shook her head at each idea, the small, polite shake of a child who did not wish to seem rude. Then she looked up at him. "You said the wishes could be for anyone." "They can." She reached out and touched the first card with the very tip of one finger. "I want Mommy to have 1 whole weekend off every month," she said, "and she still gets paid, even when she isn't working." Alessandro felt Sophia go very still behind him. Emma continued in the same soft, patient voice, as though she were explaining something that ought to have been obvious. "Mommy always wakes up before the sun. She works when it's Saturday. She works when it's Sunday. She says resting costs money." She glanced at her mother, then back at Alessandro. "I just want, one time, for Mommy to sleep until it's bright outside, and then we can make pancakes when she isn't tired." Sophia made a small sound behind him. Not a word. Something smaller than a word. Alessandro turned toward the window. He did not turn because he was thinking. He turned because he could not, in that moment, trust his own face. The rain had begun some time while they were speaking. It struck the tall glass in a soft, uneven pattern, and beyond it the garden lights burned in blurred halos. He stood there for what felt like a long time. One hand braced against the window frame, and he was 30 years old again, standing at the door of a small apartment, waiting for a mother who would come home too tired to eat the dinner he had tried to keep warm. When he finally turned back, his voice was steady, though his eyes were not. "Your first wish is granted." The first paid weekend arrived 9 days later. Sophia had not believed it would truly happen, until she saw her name removed from the Saturday and Sunday rosters, printed instead in a neat block that read, "Scheduled off, paid." She had stared at the schedule for a long moment before she folded it carefully and slipped it into the pocket of her apron. That Saturday morning, Emma woke first. She stood beside her mother's bed for nearly 10 minutes, patiently watching, waiting for the small movement that would tell her Sophia was allowed to sleep a little longer. She did not shake the mattress. She did not climb up. She simply held her cloth rabbit and waited, the way she had learned to wait outside every closed door in the estate. Sophia did not wake until the light through the window had turned pale gold. When she finally opened her eyes, she found her daughter already smiling at her. "You slept past the sun," Emma whispered, as though announcing a small miracle. They did nothing extravagant that day. Sophia counted out enough coins for a small carton of eggs and a bottle of maple syrup from the corner market. They mixed pancake batter together in the little kitchen behind the staff quarters, Emma pouring while Sophia stirred, half the flour landing somewhere it did not belong. They ate on the floor because it felt more like a picnic, that way. They watched an old animated film on the small television, one Sophia had loved as a child. In the afternoon they walked to the public park 3 blocks from the estate, and Emma insisted that grown-ups deserved swing turns too. And Sophia, laughing, let herself be pushed. She could not remember the last time her legs had felt this weightless. On Monday morning, Emma returned to the estate with a folded piece of paper pressed carefully between the pages of one of her picture books. She waited outside the study door until Alessandro opened it himself, which he almost never did. She held the paper up to him with both hands. "For you," she said, "because you gave the wish." He unfolded it slowly at his desk. It was a crayon drawing, 2 stick figures. The larger one lay beneath a wide blue blanket, eyes closed, mouth curved into a small line that was clearly meant to be a smile. The smaller figure stood beside the bed with fair hair and bright red shoes. Above them, in the upper corner, a great yellow sun bloomed as large as everything else on the page. Across the top, in the careful, uneven letters of a mother helping a small hand find the right shapes, 4 words had been written. "Mommy slept very late." Alessandro looked at the drawing for a long time. He did not hang it. He did not place it on the shelf beside the framed photographs of business partners and old associates. Instead, he opened the top drawer of his desk, laid the paper flat, and closed the drawer gently, as though closing a book he did not wish to lend. Later that afternoon, he passed Emma in the corridor and stopped. "Have you thought about your other 2 wishes?" he asked. Emma tilted her head. She considered the question with the same solemn attention she gave everything. "Not yet," she said. "Mommy is still using the first one." Alessandro caught himself smiling before he remembered how long it had been since he last did. Marco Bellini arrived at the study on Tuesday evening, carrying a slim folder and an expression of measured concern. He knocked twice, waited for permission, and stepped inside with the quiet competence that 10 years of service had polished into a kind of art. He set the folder on the corner of Alessandro's desk, poured himself no coffee, and stood with his hands folded in front of him until Alessandro looked up. "You seem troubled, Marco." "Not troubled, sir. Careful." Alessandro closed the ledger he had been reading. "Sit." Marco sat. He did not open the folder immediately. "I want to raise something with you, sir, and I would rather raise it now than later. It concerns the housekeeper, Miss Carter." Alessandro's expression did not change, but his hand paused briefly against the edge of the desk. "Go on." "I looked into her employment history after the weekend arrangement was confirmed. Standard practice, nothing more. I found something I felt you ought to know." Marco laid one fingertip on the folder without opening it. "In the past 2 years, Miss Carter has contacted the payroll office 4 separate times. Each time she asked about paid leave for long-term staff, whether it existed, whether she would qualify, whether unused days could be carried into a new year." He allowed a small pause. "I am not raising this to accuse anyone, sir. I want that understood." "Then what are you raising it for?" Marco lowered his eyes for a moment, the way a man does when he wishes to appear reluctant to speak. "The child is 3 years old, sir. 3. When I heard what she asked for, I confess I was moved. Anyone would have been. But I have been thinking about it since, and I cannot make the arithmetic work in my head. A wish for a paid weekend, phrased exactly the way an adult would phrase it, from a girl who is not yet old enough to tie a shoelace on her own." He looked up again. "Children repeat what they hear. I only wonder whether Miss Carter has been repeating certain things within earshot of her daughter, perhaps for some time, perhaps hoping that one day the right ear would happen to hear." He let the silence do the rest of the work. Alessandro did not answer immediately. He looked past Marco toward the closed drawer of his desk, where a crayon drawing lay folded beneath a leather blotter. He thought of Emma's careful, patient voice, and of the way she had refused shoes and cookies and comfort with the same quiet certainty. He did not believe what Marco was suggesting. He did not want to believe it. But suspicion was not something Alessandro Moretti had ever been able to switch off at will. He had watched a cousin embrace him one week and empty his accounts the next. He had watched a friend accept a gift on a Tuesday and testify against the family on a Friday. He had watched every soft thing in his life be used against him, again and again, until softness itself had come to feel like a warning. "I appreciate your discretion, Marco." "Of course, sir." "Pull her file. Every note, every request, every scheduling change. I want it on my desk by tomorrow morning." "Yes, sir." Marco rose, inclined his head, and left the room without another word. Marco delivered the file himself the following morning, a little before 9. He set it on the corner of the desk with the same careful precision he brought to every task, then stepped back and folded his hands. "Everything you requested, sir. I took the liberty of arranging it in chronological order." Alessandro opened the folder without a word. The file had been prepared with the smooth thoroughness of a man who had done this kind of work 100 times. Every page was labeled. Every date was underlined. Every attachment carried a small note in Marco's neat, unhurried handwriting. The first section confirmed what Marco had already reported: 4 separate inquiries to the payroll office over roughly 2 years. Each one asked in slightly different words about paid leave for long-term staff. None of them had been rude. None of them had demanded anything. But they had been repeated. The second section was more damaging. According to the records, Sophia had been formally offered scheduled weekends off on 6 separate occasions over the past 3 years. In each case, the file noted, she had voluntarily declined the offered rest in exchange for additional paid hours. Each declined weekend carried a digital signature confirming her acceptance of the trade. Each signature was accompanied by a small, tidy note in Marco's handwriting. "Employee prefers additional compensation. Verbally confirmed." Signed under witness. The notes were calm. They were reasonable. They were exactly what a diligent administrator would record. Alessandro read them all. Then he read them again. He set the folder down and rested his fingertips against the edge of the desk. He did not look at Marco. He did not need to. Marco was already saying, quietly, "I am not drawing any conclusions, sir. I am only presenting what the record shows. Leave it with me." "Of course, sir." Marco withdrew as smoothly as he had entered. For a long time after the door closed, Alessandro did not move. He turned in his chair and looked at the tall window, then at the fireplace, then at the closed top drawer of his desk. Finally, he opened the drawer. The crayon drawing lay exactly where he had left it. 2 stick figures, a blue blanket, a sun as large as everything else on the page. Mommy slept very late. He stared at the drawing for a long moment. Something in the folder did not fit. He could feel it in the way a good soldier feels a wrong footstep behind him in the dark, but he could not point to it. Every date matched. Every signature was clean. Every note read exactly the way an honest note should read. And yet the picture on the paper in front of him did not sound like a child who had been coached. It sounded like a child who had been watching her mother too closely for too long. He tried to hold both truths in his mind at once. He could not. One of them had to be a lie. Slowly, another suspicion began to move alongside the first, and he could not decide which of them frightened him more. Either Sophia had shaped her daughter into a small, careful instrument, or someone had shaped the file on his desk to look exactly the way he was now seeing it. He did not know which possibility he wanted to believe. By late afternoon, he made a decision he already half regretted. He asked one of the housekeepers to tell Miss Carter to come to the library after her shift. Sophia arrived at the library just after 8 in the evening. She had changed out of her working apron but had not taken the time to change her uniform. Her hair was pulled back in a hurried knot. She stopped in the doorway when she saw the folder open on the low table beside Alessandro's chair, and something in her posture straightened. "You wanted to see me, sir. Please. Come in. Sit down." She stepped inside. But she did not sit. She stood with her hands folded at her waist, exactly the way she had been trained to stand in front of employers who could dismiss her without warning. Alessandro did not press her. He gestured toward the folder. "I have been reviewing your employment file, Miss Carter. I would like to ask you about a few things directly, rather than through anyone else." "Yes, sir." He turned the folder so that she could see it. He tapped the first section. "You contacted the payroll office 4 times in the past 2 years. You asked about paid leave for long-term staff. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. May I ask why?" Sophia's throat moved before her voice did. "Another housekeeper, Margaret, told me once that employees who had been here long enough might qualify for paid time off. Emma's preschool had a family weekend last spring. I wanted to attend. I asked whether I would be eligible." She paused. "Mr. Bellini told me I was not. I asked again several months later, hoping something had changed. He told me the same thing. I stopped asking after the 4th time." Alessandro turned the page. "According to this file, you were formally offered 6 weekends off over the last 3 years. Each time you voluntarily declined in exchange for additional pay. Your signature confirms each one." Sophia stared at the page. For a moment she said nothing. She simply read. Then her face changed. It was not the change of a person caught in a lie. It was slower than that, and quieter, and much more painful to watch. It was the change of a person who has just understood, for the first time, exactly what she is being accused of. She lifted her eyes to his. "Sir," she said, her voice very careful. "I have never signed any of those forms." Alessandro did not answer. She looked down at the folder again. She looked at the tidy notes in Marco's handwriting. She looked at the digital signatures that were not hers. Then she looked back at him, and this time her voice was not careful at all. "You believe I taught her to say those things, Miss Carter. You believe I taught my 3-year-old daughter to stand in front of you and ask for a paid weekend so that you would be moved enough to grant it. That is what this is. I am asking questions. I am not accusing. You are accusing." She reached up to her collar with steady hands and unclipped the small identification badge pinned there. She placed it on the table beside the folder. She did not slam it. She set it down as gently as she had set down every dish and every folded sheet in this house for 3 years. "I can bear hard work, sir. I have borne it my whole life. But I will not allow my daughter's love for me to be investigated like a business deal." She turned toward the door. "Miss Carter, I will finish the week. Then Emma and I will leave. There is a wound only the innocent can carry, and it is the wound of being disbelieved by someone who had begun to matter." Sophia did not finish the week. She was gone by the following afternoon. She packed in silence. There was very little to pack. A few picture books stacked in the order Emma liked to be read them. The tin of crayons, the lid dented from being sat on more than once, the mended cloth rabbit, which Emma refused to let out of her hand, the worn shoes Emma still wore, and the second pair Sophia had bought second-hand 2 winters ago and never had the heart to throw away. Emma did not understand why they were packing. She stood in the small doorway of the staff quarters with her rabbit against her chest, watching her mother fold clothes with hands that would not stop trembling. Sophia had wiped her face twice already. Emma had not asked why. She had only tightened her grip on the rabbit's paw until the mended ear folded flat against her chin. Once, quietly, she said, "Mommy?" Sophia turned away so that the child would not see. "It's all right, sweetheart. We are going home for a while. Are we coming back?" Sophia did not answer. Before she left, she carried a large paper bag into the main house and set it on the kitchen table. Alessandro had asked one of his assistants to purchase it several weeks earlier, after he had noticed the state of Emma's belongings. Inside were a small winter coat, a proper pair of children's boots, a set of new drawing pencils, and a soft blanket with rabbits printed along the border. Sophia had never opened the bag. She had never even brought it into the staff quarters. On the top she placed a folded note, careful handwriting, no signature. "Mr. Moretti, thank you for trying to be kind. Emma needs to learn that kindness cannot come with suspicion attached. Please give these to another child." Then she took Emma by the hand and walked her out through the service gate. Alessandro did not learn they were gone until an hour later, when a housekeeper came looking for the kitchen keys. He went to the kitchen himself. He stood beside the paper bag for a long moment before he opened it. Everything was untouched. The coat still had its tags. The boots still had their tissue paper. The blanket was folded the way it had come from the shop. Beneath the tissue paper at the bottom of the bag, he found Emma's old shoes. He lifted them out with both hands. The heels had cracked further along one seam. The soles were nearly smooth. They had been placed side by side, laces tucked in, the way a child places shoes at the end of the day when she has been taught to keep her small things tidy. Inside the left shoe, folded neatly into quarters and tucked all the way down against the toe, was the crayon drawing. Mommy slept very late. Alessandro sat down slowly in the nearest chair, the small worn shoes still in his hands, and for a very long time he did not move. Then he went upstairs to his study, opened his private line, and made 2 calls. The first was to the auditor he trusted most. The second canceled every appointment he had scheduled for the following week. Some truths only begin to surface when the person you have wronged is no longer in the room to defend herself. It was almost 10 o'clock when the knock came at the library door. Alessandro was still awake, still at the desk, the small worn shoes placed carefully at one edge, and the folder from Marco at the other. He had not opened the folder again. He had barely moved in 3 hours. "Come in." The door opened slowly, and Margaret Ellis stepped inside. She was a small, sturdy woman in her late 50s, her gray hair pulled back into the same tight bun she had worn for as long as anyone at the estate could remember. She had served the Moretti household for more than 10 years. She was the one who had interviewed Sophia. She was the one who had told Sophia that a child could sometimes be allowed to live in the rear quarters. She had never spoken to Alessandro in his private study before, and she did not step past the threshold now. "Sir," she said, "may I come in, please?" She closed the door behind her with both hands. She glanced once over her shoulder, the way a person glances when she is afraid of being followed. Then she walked to the desk and stood in front of it, her fingers laced tightly at her waist. "I would not have come, sir," she said. "But Miss Carter is gone, and I do not think she should have been the one to go." Alessandro looked up. "Sit down, Margaret. I would rather stand, if that is all right." He nodded. She took a small breath and steadied herself. 3 years ago, this past winter, my husband needed surgery, his heart. It was not scheduled. I asked Mr. Bellini for 4 days of paid leave. I had been here 7 years by then, and I believed I was entitled to something. He told me the request was denied. He told me the policy did not allow it. Alessandro said nothing. A week later, I was emptying the wastebasket beside his office. I found my request, unsigned, never entered into the system. It had been thrown away the same day I gave it to him. Her voice did not shake, but her eyes glistened. "I did not say anything, sir. I was afraid. My husband recovered. I needed the work. But after that I began to watch." She reached into the deep pocket of her cardigan and drew out a small notebook. It had a soft cloth cover, worn at the corners, and a rubber band around it to hold the pages closed. She placed it on the desk. "I wrote down everything," she said. "Every request I heard about that was denied. Every person who was told the rules came from you. Every message the staff sent one another when a leave request disappeared. I kept it because I hoped one day someone would ask." Alessandro slid the band off the notebook with careful fingers. He turned the pages. Names, dates, small phrases in the corners. A gardener denied a funeral day. A cook denied a Christmas evening. A driver's wife in the hospital. A young maid whose sister had been in a car accident. Beside each entry, in Margaret's steady handwriting, the same 3 words appeared again and again. "Mr. Bellini said." He turned another page. And another. Sophia's name appeared 17 times. A house begins to unravel from the moment one person finally decides to write the truth down. Alessandro did not summon Marco that night. He had spent too many years at the head of a dangerous family to make the mistake of showing anger before he understood the ground beneath his feet. Anger would only warn Marco. Silence would keep him still. Instead, before Margaret had reached the corridor outside the library, Alessandro was already lifting the private line. By midnight, 3 men had arrived at the estate through the service gate. 2 were forensic auditors he had used for sensitive family matters twice before. Neither had ever spoken publicly about their work. The third was Nico, a soft-spoken systems specialist who had grown up 2 streets from Alessandro and would, if asked, walk through fire for the family without pausing to ask why. Alessandro gave 3 instructions. Freeze every account Marco Bellini has access to. Every ledger, every schedule, every personnel file, every camera log. Do it without touching the interface he sees. When he sits down at his terminal in the morning, everything must look exactly as he left it. But nothing he types can save. Nico nodded once and disappeared toward the administrative wing. "You two," Alessandro said to the auditors, "will work from the small conference room. I want the household personnel system compared line by line against this." He placed Margaret's small notebook on the table. Every date, every name. Especially the 17 entries for Miss Carter. The senior auditor picked up the notebook the way a surgeon picks up an instrument. "By when, sir?" "By breakfast." They worked through the night. Alessandro did not sleep. He sat in the study with the door open a hand's width so that any change in the household would reach him. He listened to the estate breathe around him for the first time in years, and he realized how little of it he had ever actually heard. At 6:40 in the morning, the senior auditor came to the door. He was carrying a printout thick enough to require both hands. "Sir, you will want to see this." Alessandro cleared the desk. The auditor laid the pages down and turned them one by one. Sophia Carter had submitted 17 written leave requests over 3 years. All 17 had been received into the system with a valid timestamp. All 17 had then been altered within minutes of arrival. Some had been marked as employee withdrawn. Others had been reclassified as voluntary shift swaps. 6 had simply been deleted, then re-entered later that same night as offers she had declined in exchange for extra pay. Every alteration had been made under a single administrator password, Marco's. Many of the changes had been made between 1 and 3 in the morning, hours when no legitimate scheduling work was ever done. The auditor turned another page. "There is one more thing, sir. The rule prohibiting household staff from using the estate vehicles for personal transport. We searched every approved handbook, every signed memorandum, every board minute going back 12 years. It does not exist. It was never approved by you. It appears in the staff instructions binder as an addendum in Mr. Bellini's own hand, presented as your personal directive. Alessandro stared down at the pages for a long moment. He thought of a small girl in worn shoes walking through rain because her mother had believed she was not allowed to accept a ride. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Leave it all with me," the auditor withdrew. Alessandro did not stop with the personnel files. He instructed the two auditors to move next to the household finances. He wanted every ledger, every invoice, every wire, every reimbursement request Marco Bellini had approved in the past 3 years laid out on a table where a man could see the whole shape of them at once. By late afternoon, the small conference room had filled with paper. The senior auditor stood at the head of the table with his sleeves rolled to the elbow. His expression had shifted at some point during the day, and Alessandro could see the change the moment he stepped into the room. This was no longer the face of a man reviewing scheduling irregularities. This was the face of a man who had found something much older and much colder, hiding underneath. "Sir," he said, "you should sit down for this." Alessandro did not sit. The auditor began at one end of the table. For roughly 3 years, small amounts have been leaving the estate operating budget, none of them large enough on their own to raise a flag. A repair invoice inflated by 7%. A landscaping contract padded by a few $100s each quarter. A wine order billed twice, once through the correct vendor and once through what appears to be a phantom subsidiary. Individually, nothing. Cumulatively, over 3 years, more than $400,000. He turned to the next stack. Every diverted payment travels through one of 4 shell companies. On the surface, they look unrelated, but when we trace their registered agents, their office addresses, and the accountants who filed their returns, all 4 eventually connect to a single holding entity. He tapped the printed page. The holding entity belongs to the Romano family. Alessandro felt something inside him go very still. The Romanos. He knew the name the way a man knows the name of a disease his father had died from. The Romanos had been circling the Moretti territory for years. Careful, patient, never quite provoking a full response. Always waiting for a moment of weakness. Twice in the past 18 months, shipments Alessandro had believed to be perfectly protected had gone wrong at exactly the wrong point in the route. Once, a meeting he had thought was known to only 4 people had ended with 2 of those 4 dead in a parking garage. He had blamed himself. He had blamed carelessness. He had never blamed the man who arranged his coffee every morning. "Continue." The auditor took a slow breath. "The money is the smaller part, sir. When we cross-reference the dates of the diverted payments with entries from the security office logs, a pattern appears. On each of the days a payment was routed to a Romano shell, Mr. Bellini accessed either the security roster, the transport schedule, or your personal calendar within the same 24 hours. He laid 3 sheets on the table. He was not stealing from you. He was being paid for information. The theft was a courier fee. The real product was you." Alessandro looked down at the papers. 10 years. 10 years of quiet coffee brought to his desk. 10 years of a familiar voice at his shoulder murmuring, as it always did, "As you wish, sir." 10 years of a snake wearing the shape of a friend. He closed his eyes for one breath. When he opened them, his voice was perfectly level. "Who else knows what you have found?" "No one, sir. Only the 3 of us in this room. Keep it that way, until I say otherwise. Some betrayals are so old that by the time you see them, they have already outlived every friendship you thought you had." The auditors were still packing their files when Alessandro turned to Nico. "Pull every corridor camera outside my private office. 6 months back, all of it. That is close to 100 hours of footage, sir. Then we begin tonight." They set up in the small security annex behind the kitchen, a room Marco had never been invited to enter. 2 monitors, 2 chairs, a pot of coffee that neither of them touched. Nico ran the footage at 4 times normal speed and slowed it whenever a figure appeared in the frame. For nearly 2 hours, they saw nothing unusual. Housekeepers in the early morning, a gardener carrying tools past the wrong doorway, Alessandro himself entering and leaving at expected hours. Then, on a timestamp 4 months old, Nico's hand went to the keyboard. "Sir," the frame showed the corridor outside the private office at 11:43 at night. The office door was closed. The hallway was empty except for a single figure kneeling on the marble with a bucket beside her and a wet cloth in her hand. Sophia. She was scrubbing a mark near the baseboard. Her uniform was rumpled at the sleeves. Even through the low-resolution feed, Alessandro could see how tired she was. She dipped the cloth in the bucket, wrung it out, and pressed it back to the marble with the slow determination of someone who had already been on her feet for 14 hours. Then the office door opened. Marco stepped out. He closed the door behind him with the careful noiselessness of a man who did not wish to be heard. He was carrying nothing visible in his hands, but he tucked something into the inside pocket of his jacket before he turned into the corridor. He froze when he saw her. Sophia looked up. For perhaps 2 seconds, the two of them held each other's gaze. Sophia's expression did not change. She was too tired to be curious, too used to men in this house passing through corridors at strange hours to think anything of it. She lowered her eyes and returned to scrubbing. Marco walked past her without a word. He did not look back. But halfway down the corridor, at the very edge of the frame, he glanced over his shoulder. The camera caught his face for one clear second. He was not angry. He was calculating. Nico paused the footage. Alessandro stared at the still image for a long moment. She did not know what she saw. No, sir. She kept scrubbing. But he knew that she had seen him. Yes, sir. Alessandro rose from the chair and walked slowly to the small window. Outside, the estate gardens lay quiet under the security lights. Somewhere beyond those lights, in a small apartment he had not yet found, a woman was folding her 3-year-old daughter's clothes into a suitcase and trying to explain why a house they had lived in for 3 years was no longer safe. He thought of the file on his desk, 17 deleted requests, not spread evenly across 3 years, concentrated, cluttered in the past 4 months. He thought of the endless double shifts assigned to a woman who could barely stand, of the family weekend at Emma's preschool she had been told she could not attend, of the rides in the rain she had been told she was forbidden to accept. Marco had not been punishing her for being poor. He had been trying to break her. He had wanted her exhausted enough to leave the estate on her own, so that whatever she had seen in that corridor would walk out through the service gate with her and never form a sentence in front of the wrong ear. And what he had not counted on, what no ledger in his careful hand had ever accounted for, was a 3-year-old girl in worn shoes who had asked a Mafia Boss for 1 paid weekend a month so her mother could finally sleep past sunrise. A cruelty engineered in silence can be undone by a kindness too small to be considered a threat. Marco Bellini had survived 10 years in the Moretti household by trusting one instinct above all others. He knew when the temperature of a room had changed, even if no one in it had spoken a word. By late morning, the temperature had changed. His administrator terminal responded a fraction of a second slower than it should have. A folder he had opened at 8:42 returned to him as read-only when he tried to save. A quarterly finance meeting he had been part of for 3 years had, at 9:15, been rescheduled by internal calendar without his name on the invitation list. The senior auditor's car, which never appeared on the estate without prior notice, had been parked at the service entrance since before sunrise. Marco did not react. He did not raise his voice. He did not look up from his ledger for longer than a moment. But by 11, he was already moving. He locked the door of his office. He opened the small floor safe behind the credenza and removed 3 passports in 3 different names, a stack of unmarked bills, and a slim envelope of numbered account codes. He slid everything into an unremarkable leather case. He placed it beneath his desk. Then he called a number he had memorized so completely that he had never once written it down. The line answered on the second ring. "He knows about the money," Marco said quietly. "Perhaps not everything, but enough." The voice on the other end was calm. "Then you leave tonight." "I will. But first I need to close the loose thread." "The housekeeper? She saw me leave his office 4 months ago. She did not understand then. She may understand now. If the right person asks the right question." A pause. "Do what you have to do. Make it look like her." Marco set the phone down. He had already prepared for this possibility. In the false bottom of a filing cabinet, he kept an envelope of $10,000 in used bills, a false identification card with Sophia's photograph clumsily reprinted from her personnel file, and 3 photocopied documents that, taken together, would suggest to any investigator that Sophia Carter had been in contact with the Romano family for over a year. He would plant it in her belongings before she left the property. Then he would call an anonymous tip to the family's own internal enforcement office and disappear during the confusion. If Alessandro spent the next 48 hours investigating a false spy, he would not be chasing the real one. Marco motioned to 2 of the outside men on his payroll and gave a single quiet instruction. "Bring her to the West warehouse. The child too. Do not damage them. I need to place items in her bag before anyone else searches it." At 11:40 in the morning, Sophia was carrying the last of Emma's belongings toward the service gate. Emma walked half a step behind her, one hand clutching her rabbit, the other holding a folded piece of paper she had refused to leave in the apartment. It was another crayon drawing. This one showed 3 figures under a smaller sun, and Emma had not yet decided whether she was allowed to give it to anyone. The 2 men appeared at the end of the corridor without sound. Sophia had a single moment to recognize what she was looking at. She stepped in front of Emma. She did not scream. Her first thought, as it had always been, was for her daughter. She whispered, "Hold on to Mommy." And Emma, understanding without needing to be told, tightened her small fingers on the fabric of Sophia's coat. One of the men reached for Sophia's arm. Emma's drawing slipped from her fingers. The folded paper drifted once against the marble and settled near the baseboard, half open, one crayon corner facing up, 3 stick figures, a sun, fair hair, bright red shoes. They were led through the service door and into the back of a waiting vehicle within 30 seconds. The corridor returned to silence. The drawing lay on the floor, small and bright, waiting for the one person in the house who would recognize what it meant. A predator who plans against a mother has forgotten what happens when someone finally begins to look for the child. The call reached Alessandro at 11:52. Margaret's voice on the internal line was thin and shaking. "Sir, Miss Carter and Emma are gone. Not through the front, through the service corridor. There is something on the floor you need to see." He was already moving before she finished speaking. He reached the corridor within a minute. He saw the small folded paper against the baseboard before he saw anything else. He knelt without thinking about the marble against his knee, and he lifted the drawing between 2 fingers. 3 stick figures, a sun, fair hair on the smallest one, bright red shoes. Something inside him that had been closed for a very long time cracked open with a sound only he could hear. For years, Alessandro Moretti had been afraid of only one thing: losing his empire, territory, reputation, control. He had trained himself not to fear the loss of any single person, because in his world people were taken from you constantly, and grief was a luxury a man in his position could not afford. Standing in that corridor with the small paper in his hand, he felt, for the first time in more years than he could count, the specific and terrible fear of losing someone. Not something, someone, 2 of them. He rose to his feet, and his voice, when it came, was very quiet and very cold. "Nico, pull the last 30 minutes from every gate camera, now." The footage took less than 4 minutes. A dark sedan registered to one of Marco's outside contractors had left the west service gate at 11:43, moving without hurry. It had turned south on the access road and disappeared past the tree line. Alessandro was already in the front seat of his own vehicle when Nico called through the earpiece. "Sir, that plate, traced to an address in the Western Industrial District. A shell company. It owns an abandoned warehouse off Ellery Street. No electricity billed in 18 months. But there is a private utility line still active. Send everyone. Quietly. No sirens. Nothing that reaches the perimeter before I do." 3 vehicles followed him. 6 men, hand-picked from among those who would have died before speaking to the Romanos. None of them asked questions. The warehouse sat at the end of a cracked service road, its windows painted black from the inside, its loading bay chained. A single service door on the north wall showed the faint gleam of a lock recently oiled. Alessandro's men fanned out along the walls without a sound. He gave one gesture, and the door was opened. Inside, the air smelled of concrete dust and machine oil. A single lamp lit the center of the empty floor. Sophia sat tied to a wooden chair beneath the lamp, her wrists bound in front of her, her uniform still creased from the morning's packing. Her eyes were red but dry. Emma sat in her lap with the cloth rabbit pressed to her chest, her small face buried in her mother's shoulder. Marco Bellini stood 10 paces beyond them, hands in his coat pockets, perfectly composed. He did not startle when he saw Alessandro. He almost smiled. "You should not have come alone, sir." "I did not." Marco's eyes moved briefly to the shadows near the walls, and something in his face slackened at the edges. 10 years, he said. Not to Alessandro, not to anyone in particular, just to the concrete floor between them. 10 years I stood at your shoulder. I ordered your car. I balanced your books. I saved your life twice, and you never said my name unless you needed something. I was never a partner. I was a coat rack. I was a set of hands. His voice tightened. Do you know what it feels like to be invisible in the house you built for another man? A wound left to fester for 10 years does not need a knife to finally cut someone. Marco lifted his eyes. And all of this, he said, his voice unraveling at the edges. All of it, because you finally decided to notice a 3-year-old girl and her housekeeper mother. 10 years I stood beside you, and it took a child's cookie and a pair of worn shoes to make you open your eyes. Alessandro did not move toward him. That was your mistake, Marco. My mistake. You believed the people who had no power did not matter. He took a single slow step forward, angling his body between the wooden chair and the far end of the warehouse. You served me for 10 years. In 10 years, you never once looked down at the woman who scrubbed the floor under your feet. She was invisible to you the way you say I made you invisible. That is why she saw what you did 4 months ago and thought nothing of it. And that is why, when I finally began to see her, I began to see you. Marco's hand moved half an inch toward the inside of his coat. Alessandro's fingers brushed the face of his wristwatch. The signal was small enough that no one in the room saw it happen. But everyone in the darkness beyond the lamp had been waiting for exactly that motion. The warehouse erupted. The lamp above the chair swung wildly as bodies moved through the dim outer edges. 2 of Marco's men appeared from a doorway to the left, weapons already rising, and were down before they cleared the frame. A muffled shout came from the loading bay, then a heavier sound, then silence. Somewhere behind Sophia, glass broke. The lamp jerked once and stayed on. Alessandro did not lunge for Marco. He lunged for the chair. He reached Sophia in 3 strides. He pulled Emma from her lap in one motion, gathered her against his chest, and turned his back to the far end of the warehouse so that his own body was between the child and whatever might come from that direction. Emma made a sound half like a cry and half like a question. He pressed her small head into the crook of his neck. "I have you," he said, low against her hair. "I have you." A single shot cracked from somewhere near the loading bay. Alessandro felt something hot pass along the top of his shoulder. Not the deep cold of a serious wound, the thin, bright sting of a graze. He did not loosen his grip on the child. 2 of his men were already at Sophia's chair, cutting the cords at her wrists. She rose unsteadily and reached for her daughter, and Alessandro placed Emma back into her arms as carefully as if he were setting down something made of glass. "Get them out. Through the north door. Do not stop." They were gone within seconds. The last of Marco's men went down near the far wall. Alessandro's men closed in on the center of the floor. Marco stood alone under the lamp. He looked, for the first time in 10 years, exactly his age. "Alive," Alessandro said quietly. His men understood. They took Marco to the floor without ceremony. There was one short, sharp sound, and one longer one, and then the sound of a body being turned onto its stomach and cuffed with the kind of restraints that had never left a Moretti holding room without a full confession. Alessandro walked past him without looking down. He stepped out through the north door into the pale afternoon light. Sophia was already on her knees on the gravel, her arms wrapped around Emma, whispering the same words over and over. Alessandro pressed his palm briefly to his shoulder. The wound was shallow. It would keep. He walked toward them without saying anything at all. A man who has finally learned what he cannot afford to lose will place his own body between it and every bullet in the world. They returned to the estate in a small, quiet convoy. Alessandro allowed the family doctor to close the graze on his shoulder in the corner of the kitchen, while Sophia sat 2 rooms away with Emma asleep against her chest. He would not go upstairs until the wound was dressed. He would not send anyone else to speak to Sophia in his place. That evening, well after the household had settled and the outside auditors had left with their sealed folders, he walked to the rear staff quarters alone. He knocked at the small door. Sophia opened it with Emma still asleep on her shoulder. "May I come in for a moment?" She stepped aside. The apartment was almost empty. The suitcase still sat by the door. The books had been repacked. He stood just inside the threshold, aware of the smallness of the room, and of the fact that he had never once before entered the space where the people who kept his house alive actually lived. "Miss Carter," he said, "I owe you an apology, and I would like to give it to you before I ask you for anything." Sophia said nothing. She lowered Emma gently into the small bed against the wall and drew a blanket over her, and only then did she turn to face him. "I doubted you," he said. "I looked at a folder prepared by a man I had trusted for 10 years, and I chose to believe it over what my own eyes had already told me about you and your daughter. That is the first thing I am sorry for. It is the smaller thing." He drew a breath. "The larger thing is this. Marco was able to do what he did for years because I did not look. I spent 30 years defending my empire and not one afternoon watching the people who make coffee for me every morning. He stole from you, from Margaret, from the gardeners, from the drivers, from a dozen others, and he stole from all of you inside a house that carries my name. He could not have done it if I had been paying attention. That failure is mine." Sophia stood very still. "I am asking you to come back," he said, "but I will understand if you cannot." For a long moment she did not answer. She looked at her sleeping daughter. She looked at her hands. "I will come back," she said finally, "but not for privileges. Name your condition. No exception for me. No special hours. No quiet arrangement that disappears the moment attention moves elsewhere. Every worker in this house must receive what I have been denied. A leave system that cannot be altered by one man. Written records no one can quietly erase. An independent line for complaints that does not pass through a supervisor. Safe transportation home after night shifts. And the rule against staff using the estate cars, the one Marco invented, must be gone. Agreed. All of it. Beginning tomorrow. In writing. In writing. Signed by me. Posted in the staff corridor by morning." Sophia's shoulders eased for the first time that day. 2 weeks later, When the new system had begun to settle into the rhythm of the household, Alessandro asked her to take a position none of the staff had held before, senior household supervisor, with authority to review scheduling alongside an independent payroll firm. She hesitated. She did not want to be seen as rewarded for a wound. Then Margaret spoke from the kitchen doorway. "You are the one who knows what it feels like when no one listens." Sophia accepted. A house rebuilt around one person's dignity will hold every other person more gently for it. Several months later, the Moretti estate had changed in ways a visitor would not have noticed at first glance. The gardens still looked the same. The stone walls still rose above the same iron gates. But inside the corridors, the people had begun to walk differently. Housekeepers spoke to one another without lowering their voices. Drivers offered rides without waiting to be asked twice. Cooks went home at the end of their shifts, instead of finding one more task that might save them from a written reprimand. Margaret Ellis finally kept the medical appointment she had postponed for 2 winters. Emma became a part of Alessandro's daily life in a way he had never planned. She ran into his study without knocking. She brought him drawings when the ink on them was still wet. She placed cookies broken into 2 uneven pieces on the corner of his desk, and she always kept the smaller piece for herself. She sat on the sofa in the corner while he worked, her cloth rabbit tucked under her chin, sometimes falling asleep before the last call had ended. He had once believed that soft things in a man's life were the openings through which the world hurt him. He was beginning to understand something different. Some losses cannot be healed by locking every door. Some can only be healed by finding someone worth keeping the door open for. One afternoon, Alessandro carried the 2 remaining wish cards out to the garden. Sophia stood laughing with one of the newer housekeepers by the herb beds. Emma sat cross-legged in the grass, arranging pebbles into an uneven circle. He knelt beside her and placed the cards on the grass between them. "Emma," he said, "you still have 2 wishes left. Anything you want, a trip somewhere, a room full of toys, a pretty dress, 100 books, anything." Emma looked at the cards. She looked up toward her mother, still laughing near the herb beds. She shook her head slowly. "I already had my 3 wishes," she said. "Mommy isn't tired anymore." Alessandro did not answer at once. When he did, his voice was quieter than he meant it to be. "All right, sweetheart." Later that week, without telling Emma, he met privately with a lawyer and created a protected education fund in her name, large enough to carry her through any school, any training, any future she chose to walk toward. He made 2 things very clear. The fund was not the second wish. It was not the third wish. It was simply what a man owed a child who had refused to ask him for anything. The 2 blank cards stayed in the top drawer of his desk. Beside them, in a small silver frame, hung the crayon drawing of a woman sleeping late beneath a very large sun. Real strength was never about controlling everything within a man's reach. It was about finally noticing the people who had never been given a choice at all. If this story moved something in you, we would love to know. Have you ever seen a small act of kindness change a life? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need it today. New emotional stories are uploaded every day. We wish everyone watching this video good health, peaceful days, and a heart that stays open to the people the world too often overlooks. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next video.